So I'd just like to say, all of what I know is based on the UK. I cannot claim any knowledge about mental health in Canada or in any other country, though a lot of what I say will be very relevant. So what is autism? Autism is, for those of you who don't know, a mental condition present in early development. It is characterized by great difficulty in language and relating to other people, as well as in abstract concepts. Someone with atypical autism will have many of the same symptoms and behavioral problems, but the symptoms will develop later on in development. My sister was a normal child up until the age of 20 months. But at 20 months it changed. She developed epilepsy, suffering generalized seizures, which are caused by electrical impulses throughout the entire brain. She would lose consciousness and then stiffen rigidly, going into what is known as a tonic phase. This meant she was no longer able to move, to cry, or to do anything at all. She never suffered the violent jerkings, but it would take 2 to 3 hours to recover from each fit. Due to the alarming frequency, her care was transferred to St. Ormond Street Hospital, which is Britain's most specialized hospital. There were days when she would have barely recovered from a fit, when she'd have another, and then another, and another, caught in a seemingly endless cycle. But when she turned 4, it stopped, as abruptly as it had started. Months of intermittent electrical impulses must have had some kind of long-term damage to her brain, but this has never been acknowledged. What was noted, though, were delays to her development. Her sight and hearing had completely stopped during this period, and her speech had completely delayed. Even speech therapists told her that she was never going to speak. Luckily, she did. Her processing was completely damaged. In fact, though she had average intelligence, her reading and writing skills will never surpass that of an 8-year-old. And what of her emotional development? She developed complex behavior problems, suffering extreme anxiety. One way this manifested itself was through OCD, or obsessive-compulsive disorder. This is repetitive behavior caused by unwanted thoughts and feelings. She was extremely terrified of dirt. To feel clean, she'd have to have her hands wet at all times. This meant carrying large bottles of water wherever we went. Her behavior was inappropriate and embarrassing. She'd strip naked or wet herself in large public places, or even lash out and hit people on the street just to feel safe. At the age of 6, we moved away from London to a small town. At the age of 7, my parents divorced, which was partly due to her situation. We were in a Catholic community, closely knitted, but due to her behavior, which was often antisocial and hysterical, we never integrated in. We were judged and shunned. My mother was seen as a bad parent, unable to control her. My sister was seen as some kind of freak, without a label to explain or as an excuse for the school and the community. They had nothing to blame the problems on. We looked for help everywhere. She was even put on a gluten and dairy-free diet. Anything to help. At the age of 8, she was referred to CAMS, which is Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. They weren't interested in her epilepsy, but they offered a range of therapies, including art, talking, cognitive behavior, and family therapy. In fact, they can boast of thousands of hours of footage of these therapies. But no one could help. No one could put a label on her. The only 2 widely diagnosed mental health problems in the UK are autism, which includes Asperger's, and ADHD. And she was neither of these, and this was clearly stated on her record. She started off in mainstream education, but due to her processing and learning difficulties, she needed a lot more help. Her teachers told her she'd never be able to read or write. She was extremely bullied. Her peers thought that because there was no label, that there was nothing wrong with her, and she just acted out because she was some sort of, as I said before, freak. Because of this, despite it being a religious school, at one point her classmates planned to kill her by burying her alive. At this point, she was transferred to a special education school. The battle for funding began. The council didn't want to fund her, despite her obvious need, because there was no label. But months of sending letters, visiting the local MP, my mother finally managed to get support for her. But then, at age 13, when we had to move to the next step of education, which we had to move counties, the schools told her she simply had to have a label. So after days of tests and assessments, the leading pediatric neurologist said that diagnosed her with atypical autism. This was loose enough to gather support, but vague enough to leave treatment undecided. There was so many signs and symptoms that were similar to her, but at the same time there were so many boxes that were left unopened that this label wasn't quite accurate. With the label, there came a stigma. She was lumped into a category she often couldn't relate to. She hated it. She was categorized as special. At 16, the anxieties became too much, and she left college. She left school. Her social fears were so great that she believed all men, including my father, were pedophiles. She couldn't be left alone. Her hands were often bloody, and she was extremely depressed. Because of this, it was decided that medication was the best treatment. She was put on a series of antidepressants and antipsychotics. In fact, it took over a year to stabilize her completely. At this point, she was put in a specialist autistic school where 95% of the students were on medication. She had no friends. She had never achieved basic maths or English. But despite this, she took a 2-year course in art and design, which allowed her to go to college. She started at art college this year, age 20. But the labeling that was so important then now means nothing. And the adult health services are so overstretched that unless you have a very unstable personality disorder, it's almost impossible to get funding. This, coupled with the fact that only 32% of autistic adults are in any kind of employment, means that 68%, just under 68% of autistic adults are completely reliant on their families. They have no income from jobs or from the government. So when I wrote the first draft of this speech, my sister had, despite many bad days, been coping at school. But in the past few months, she has left school or stopped going to school. She has been told that she may be bipolar, and she has become increasingly unstable and depressed, withdrawing from all outside contact. When I was walking back with her from the doctors, she turned to me and crying, she said, "I wish I had a label." Instead of not knowing what treatment to have, instead of constant tests, instead of being lumped into a category she didn't belong. But despite this, we are lucky that even though the label may not have been accurate, we managed to get one, which allowed her the funding to go to school. Not many families are so lucky. Fighting to achieve a label to get support should be completely unnecessary if the symptoms present validate a need for help. Without constant help, my sister who may never live independently, would never have realized her potential and gone to college. Labeling doesn't work. So many people are missed out, and even when it does help get through the necessary systems and necessary education. A poor diagnosis can be completely counterproductive. For each family, the story is completely different. A friend of mine who was diagnosed with ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and Asperger's, was fully diagnosed at 10, though his parent, one of them was a GP, managed to who knew it beforehand. He had all the obvious traits and common behaviors, but he had very little anxiety. And living in London, it meant he could get all the access to support and finances needed. His community, due to the obvious label, were very supportive of him. And his parents, who had picked it up early on, weren't upset by the label or the stigma that came with it. And they worked doubly hard to empower him to cope. But despite this, he struggled. He struggled that teachers knew him as autistic before they knew his name. A label brings expectations of a certain behavior. Those expectations can often lead to provoke that same behavior. It also effectively pushes back somebody's goals. It may not have been comparable to the way my sister was judged, but he too was seen, and still is seen to a certain extent, as a problem. He's seen as the label he wears. In fact, we were best friends for a long time. I didn't know he was different, but increasingly it has become more and more apparent. He struggled through his teen years. He struggled to fit in, struggling to cope socially. Even he may not have many friends now, and I even found it hard to cope, or found it hard to act around him. I didn't know to treat him my own age or act like I used to when I was younger. It's possible that we have changed, but increasingly I have seen the label before I see the friend I once knew. Labeling has given him a barrier to hide behind, a limitation for his goals, and an excuse for his behavior. Is that all he expects of himself? All that is expected of by others? If more was known, this could change. We could learn to support more children better, equipping them to become adults and living the standard of life that we have. In 2013, the DMS, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Bible, decided Asperger's was no longer considered a disorder. Instead, they widened slightly their criteria for autism. This caused so many people to go uncategorized, and they no longer got the support they needed. It also caused for those people who did now fall under autism to be treated as if they were autistic, which meant there was a stigma surrounding them, and it also meant that they were getting a completely different sort of treatment, a treatment that, in all probability, wasn't right for them. Okay, so I've spoken a lot about autism, but this isn't an issue just facing autism. For example, schizophrenia. So diverse are the symptoms that the validity of the diagnosis is widely disputed. People tend to associate schizophrenia with violence, and in fact the word is commonly used as an insult, a schizo. My grandfather was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia when my mother was in primary school. He used this to justify his growing alcoholism and his absence as a parent. My mother was sent off to boarding school and then sent off in holidays to family so that she never saw him. If he hadn't have been diagnosed, who knows what would have happened? But it would have meant that he had no excuse, that he would have held himself responsible for his actions. It was also lucky that he managed to keep the diagnosis a secret, so that there was no stigmatization around him. Children should not be given support due to their label. It should be given due to their need and their parents' need. Labels should not be so defined. It causes stigmatization and categorization. For those with labels, they become defined by that. For those without, they have no excuse and are subjected to a lot of criticism and judgment. So what should you go away remembering? I mean, is there anything that you can do? Well, just by knowing about this stuff and being aware of it and spreading the knowledge, you are helping. For example, you may be walking down the street and see a child acting out. Yes, true, it could be a bad parent, but at the same time, there could be some unknown, unseen problem. So instead of looking away in shock and disgust, or crossing the street to avoid, smile and show support, because in all likelihood, they're finding life a lot harder than you. And lastly, if you're told someone is autistic, don't automatically assume they're like their TV representation or like that kid across the street, because in all likelihood, they're not. Thank you. Thanks.